Hey adventurers! As everyone who is already eagerly anticipating Final Fantasy XIV's next expansion Dawntrail is probably already aware, the next set of Alliance raids is confirmed to be the Echoes of Vana'diel. This set of raids is based on Square's first MMO, Final Fantasy XI, released way back in 2002. So, I thought it would be fun, not to mention nostalgic, for me as a former 11 player to try and guess what characters will be appearing in this storyline. Breaking this video down into parts, we'll be going over what I think each raid will be based on, as well as what bosses will be in the 3 raids, as well as any other characters that might be allies or just make appearances. So let's hit that like, subscribe, and don't forget that notification bell, and without any further delay, let's get started on possible raid scenarios. So, the 2 images we have been shown so far is one of this demon looking entity, the Shadow Lord, who is the primary antagonist of the first story arc. The second is this wonderful collection of adventurers in traditional Final Fantasy style artwork. However, I think the artwork aside from the characters is depicting an area in Final Fantasy XI called Tavnasia, which is a key area in the Chains of Promathia expansion. Yoshi P has already hinted that with this set of raids will hit previous or current Final Fantasy XI players really hard in the feels, driving home that nostalgia. With that said, I think the 3 raids will most likely be based off the original story and the first 2 expansions, Rise of the Zilart and Chains of Promathia. I don't think there will be many, if any, appearances. Can we go with that? Why not? From key characters in the expansions following this, because either their story is overly complex to include in a raid to do the character any form of justice, or because there are already iterations of the character already being used. For example, Alexander was the final boss of Treasures of Arturgan, the expansion after Chains of Promathia, and he is already currently in Final Fantasy XIV. So for this reason, I think the first raid will be based off the original story in the game, the second raid will feature characters from Rise of the Zilart, and the last raid should feature Chains of Promathia content. But like I said before, I wouldn't rule out any appearances from characters that appear later in the game's progression. So, before we get started on my theories of the boss content of each raid, let me know in the comments who or what you think is going to show up in these raids and any theories you might have behind that appearance. So, I'll be going on the assumption there are 3 bosses in each raid, and here are my predictions for what they could be. Like I said, I think the first raid in this series is going to be based off the original story of the game. So, Boss 1, Arrowman and a Dragon. So, Raid 1 being based on the original story, I think the first boss will be the instance fight that took place near the start of the story arc. In this fight, you come up against an Arrowman known as a Seeker, Spotter or Searcher, and a dragon named Dark, Black or Dread Dragon, depending on the location of the fight. It's the first fight that all nations took part in their nation missions. It was also the first fight that took some strategy to complete and the first piece of content that people who had already completed would often offer to come and help complete. Not only because of how difficult it could be depending on your party setup, but because it was damn good fun. Boss 2, Archlich Tabaquan. This is the most I'm unsure about a prediction. I don't think it's very likely, however it's the only other shared fight between the nation missions of Bastok, Windhurst and Sandioria. I'm all out of ideas if they just follow the nation mission storyline, and this boss was the main battle obstacle when the adventure was inspecting and potentially replacing a seal in the Northlands that was holding the Shadow Lord. Speaking of the Shadow Lord, Boss 3, the Shadow Lord, the main antagonist of the original story. He was previously known as Rauagrim, more on him later. Rauagrim was betrayed and left for dead in the cold Northlands. Succumbing to his own pain, despair and anger, and guided by the Black Magicite, he travelled to the Dark Protocrystal in Ullagrand Range, making a pact with the Dark Divinity Odin. He gained an army of demons, transformed into the Shadow Lord, and started the Crystal War. So those are my predictions for Raid 1, on to Raid 2, and Rise of the Zilart. Before we get started on this section, I'd like to apologise for some of my pronunciations coming up. I can promise you they're not going to be very good, but I'll try at my best. Like I said before, I think the base of this raid will be the first expansion, Rise of the Zilart. The first boss I think are going to be the Crystal Warriors, 5 archangels that are summoned but not created by the Zilart brothers, each representing a different race and sin. Elven Arrogance, Galkan Rage, Hume Apathy, Mithrin Envy, and Taru Cowardice. They were summoned to stop the main character and NPC allies of Zed, Lion and Aldo. However, Raugrim's spirit slows them down and distracts them long enough, allowing the PC and his allies to escape. I'm going to cover the last two bosses of this raid at the same time, because I think they'll be the brothers and princes of Zilart, Archduke Camlino and Aldnash. The princes act as the main antagonists in the Rise of the Zilart expansion. Slept for 10,000 years, who woke in an age predating the Crystal War, they slowly worked to gain more respect and power with the end goal of reopening the Gate of the Gods, which in turn would unfortunately destroy all of mortal life. I think there will be separate bosses in the raid, with the younger looking elder brother Eldnash being the final boss of the second raid. Or maybe if the Archduke is the second boss and then fighting along his younger brother in the final fight. Those are just two scenarios I can think of. Anyway, these are my predictions for Raid 2. On to Raid 3 and Chains of Promathia. So, with the fact I think the last raid will be based off the second expansion, Chains of Promathia, let's have a look at what bosses I think might show up. Boss 1, Moblins and a Bugbear. An unlikely inclusion, but I would like to see it with Moblins making a debut in Dawntrail. One of the hardest initial fights in Chains of Promathia expansion was where the player faced off against 4 Moblins, Chikachuck, Mothermuck, Swiper Stick, Tricker Track, and a Bugbear known as Bugbee. It's a significant fight in the COP storyline and makes sense to include with Moblins debuting in Dawntrail. Boss 2, Oryu. Oryu was a worm boss and was a very significant fight in Chains of Promathia for a number of reasons. It was the first worm boss to be a combat encounter directly included in the main story missions. It was the first fight in 11 where the monster had a flying mechanic that avoided melee damage, and was the lowest level and easiest worm that is fought in 11. It was an obstacle put in the adventurer's way by Bahamut. Boss 3, Promathia. The end boss of Chains of Promathia expansion. He is the Twilight God and the goddess Altana's counterpart. Think like Zodiac and Hydaelyn. Promathia seeks to be reborn, and this would mean the destruction of all mortal kind. My secondary prediction for this, however, is since the Warrior of Light has a habit of fighting gods and deities and other planar beings, I think there's a slim chance that Promathia might be the end boss of the second raid, and Altana being the last boss of the last raid. There is enough crossover in the storylines of Chains of Promathia and Rise of Zilart to make it make sense, but I would much prefer it to be my original prediction, as I think I've had enough of fighting gods. With the 3 raids out of the way, let's move on and talk about my thoughts on other characters who could potentially appear in this story arc in Final Fantasy XIV. So, on to characters I think might assist the Warrior of Light, or at least in some fashion make an appearance. Raugrim. Raugrim is the Tailkeeper of the Galka, essentially their elder. Was a mythical musketeer for the nation of Bastok, however he was betrayed by Ulrich. Ulrich was jealous of his relationship with Cornelia, as well as his efforts to establish peaceful relationships with the Beastmen. As Ulrich went to kill him, Cornelia however put herself in the way and sacrificed herself. Ulrich left them both for dead, resulting in Raugrim eventually becoming the Shadow Lord. His spirit saves the adventurer from the Crystal Warriors when they first appear. Lion. Lion is a human ally who first showed up in the Arrowman and Dragon fight, and in my recollection was the first NPC to have a completely unique character design. She sacrifices herself in the Eldnash fight to stop the Crystal Line restarting, saving the world. Preesh. Preesh has the appearance of an elven child and is your main ally in Chains of Promathia. She is very intertwined in the story and helps you in the final fight against Promathia, alongside our next entry. Celtius, a mysterious being that's involved in most of the story and is probably, if not the most complex character in 11. It would take way too much time to go into any amount of detail that would be worth understanding, but he does help you in your fight against Promathia alongside Preesh. The Taru Taru trio, Shibuki siblings, Kuki, Maki and Chiruki, or as I like to call them, Huey, Dewey and Louie. They're a comedy relief trio and flip between antagonistic and protagonistic depending on the situation. Nagmalada, the main antagonist of the cop storyline. He wants to enter Altaio, the capital of Zilart, and enter the Chamber of Eventide to be reborn as a Zilart. However, this would again result in the destruction of the thing the player loves the most, which is the world. Matt. Matt provides the player with quests to raise their level cap. He's essentially Master Roshi. He was the final encounter in 75 era for the players to raise their level cap to 75. So instead of giving you quests, he was a fight, and it was notorious for being a roadblock to some players. So whatever job the player had, Matt would face you in a fight as that job. Some jobs were easier than others, to the point where some people would go and raise a completely new job just to make this fight easier and take the month or 2 months that it would take to increase your job to the right level. Shantoto, 11's most infamous character, a Tarotaro black mage who speaks in rhymes, a fan favourite NPC that topped every single poll Square Enix released at the time, which directly resulted in her getting her own add-on. Iroha. Iroha is a unique entry as she's already in 14. She is Tenzen's child in 11 and the player character's student. A very simplified description of her character arc is essentially Tenzen's sword held part of the essence of Phoenix, and through many shenanigans, Phoenix's essence was eventually transferred into Iroha. With that being said, that's the last of the characters that I think might make an appearance. So, those are my predictions for who the bosses could be and which characters might potentially show up in this story arc. Thanks for listening to what was probably a lot longer than either you or I expected this video to be. Any questions or comments, leave them below and I'll get around to answering them. See you next time, and pray return to the Waking Sands.